Yes? No? Somebody, okay, hold on. For whatever reason. Right. Oh, I said, all right, so there we go. Okay. We started the PowerPoint on Monday, right? But we didn't actually go through the Constitution yet. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. So we will start there. All right. Now, the Constitutional Convention, right, happens in Philadelphia, 1787, because we realized, or the founding fathers realized, that the Articles of Confederation weren't working, right? And we talked about the Northwest Ordinance, we talked about Shays' Rebellion. So they come together in 1787 and begin working on a new document. Now, James Madison has already been kind of brainstorming and rough drafting, and he comes up with a couple of ideas, right? And we talked about the Virginia plan versus the New Jersey plan, because they wanted to give the most power to the branch of government that would be representative of the people. In other words, the representatives from each individual area are going to be sent to the country's capital, and then they will make laws, right? Specifically taxes. So let's pull up. Let me share this with you, and we'll start going through there. There we go. And again, it's on Blackboard. This is just the Constitution. So this is the document that they hammer out. And creating the Constitution sparks a debate. After they get what they consider a final draft, they release it to the the Constitution Congress, and they go through and vote on it. All right. Now, it then is released to the public, but it has to be ratified by all 13 states. At least that's the way the articles are written. So what happens after this is released to the public is an ongoing debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? And this is what a lot of your midterm paper is about. So the Federalists are going to be those that support the Constitution as it's written. The Anti-Federalists are afraid that there's too much power given to the national government and that it doesn't protect citizens' rights and states' rights enough. Okay, and so they are going to propose that they add a Bill of Rights, similar to the English Bill of Rights that some of you did your document analysis on, right? But they want to make sure that there are certain protections, or what you would consider unalienable rights, that cannot be taken away. Okay, and those are outlined in the Bill of Rights. But we're going to start with the Constitution and go through it and really discuss kind of the major key points to this. Now, the Constitution is set up as a blueprint for the government. This is how the government works, and it details the powers that the government has. And we know that they want to have a checks and balances system, which basically means that of the three branches, they can check and balance each other. One branch can become overly powerful, okay? And they vest a lot of power in the legislative branch because that's where the populace has their representation, right? And so they come up with the three branches. They're the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, okay? And those are outlined in the Constitution. The Constitution is made up of 7 articles, okay? And the first 3 are the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. And then we'll go through the others, but they're not nearly as large. So the first thing is the preamble, right? And the preamble is basically one of the thesis statements, right? And that's what it does. The preamble is just outlining or saying what the reason is they wrote this document, the reason for the document, and what they hope the document will do, right? So that's the preamble, and which is this paragraph here, we the people. Article 1 is the legislative powers, the legislative branch. And as we said, they've decided to have a bicameral system. That means two houses. Okay, so the legislature is made up of two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, right? And taking from the Virginia plan, the House of Representatives is based on your state's population. And the senators is an equal representation for every state. And we get that from the New Jersey plan. Okay, so Senate, every state gets 2 senators. House of Representatives depends on how large or how big your population is. Okay, so they're going to call this Congress. It does consist of a Senate and House of Representatives, and it goes through. And this is the longest article. They put a lot more power and a lot more thought. I mean, I wouldn't say thought, but a lot more detail into Article 1 because this is the branch they want to be the most powerful. Okay. So it goes on to tell you what the qualifications are. If you're in the House of Representatives, you have to be 25 years old. You have to have been 7 years a citizen of the U.S. When you're elected, you have to be an inhabitant of that state from which you are elected. And members will be chosen every 2 years. So every 2 years, representatives have to get reelected. Okay. And let's see, representatives, this is a big one, and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which are included. So taxes go overall. And if you're going to create revenue, it has to come from the House of Representatives. So if it's a tax bill, it has to originate here. Okay. So according to the respective numbers, then this tells you how they're going to figure out population and how many representatives you get. Okay. It will be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years. Who are they talking about there?
Can you repeat that?
I'm sorry. The people in power? Not quite. So, all right. They're talking about how they're going to count citizens. Okay. And that will correlate to how many representatives each state gets. So they're going to add the whole number of free people, free persons, and then they're going to add in those who are bound to service for a term of years. Who are they talking about there, you think?
The slaves.
There you go. All right, so that's a nice way of saying slavery. The term of years they are talking about is a lifetime. Okay, but they're not going to put that in there. So slavery is all over the Constitution, even though it's never called slavery or enslavement. Okay, but it's in here. It's just worded better, right, according to them. They're not going to count Native Americans and 3/5 of all other persons. So this is where you get the 3/5 clause or 3/5 compromise. So they want to count, the South wants to count every single enslaved person. The North says you shouldn't be able to count any of them because they're not, in your mind, they're not citizens of your state. They're your property. So either you admit that they're people and count them as population, or, right? Unfortunately, though, this threatens to derail the entire Constitution. So they agree that they can count 3/5 of the enslaved population for population numbers. Okay. And then it says the actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after this. and then within every 10 years following that. So this is where you get the census. It's in the Constitution. We have to take a census every 10 years because we need to know how many people are in each state to determine accurate representation because a lot changes in 10 years, right? All right, one representative for every 30,000. This is originally, right? What we're going over today is how it's originally written, not how it functions today. Because trust me, representatives represent a lot more than that today, okay? But each state shall have at least one. And it goes through how many the states will start out with, okay? Then the House will elect its own speaker, etc. Then it goes on to Section 3, which are senators. Right? You're going to have 2 senators from each state. They serve a term of 6 years. But the Senate has staggered elections, which means that every 2 years, a third of the Senate is up for re-election. So at no point will the entire Senate be up for re-election. Okay? So they have staggered terms. So you have Class A, let's say that's elected this year, they won't face re-election until 6 years. Class B will face re-election in 4 years, and Class C will face re-election in 2 years. But every time you're elected, you get a 6-year term. Hopefully that's clear. And that's what this whole paragraph is talking about. You have to be 30 years old to be a senator. You have to have been a citizen for 9 years, and you have to be an inhabitant of the state in which you're elected. The Senate will choose its officers, and the vice president serves as the president of the Senate. However, he never gets to vote unless there's a tie vote. Unless there's 50 yeses and 50 nos, then he gets to vote and break the tie. Okay, which rarely happens. But that is part of his job. And there's also, they elect a pro tempore, which is in the absence of the vice president. And in this instance, they're talking about if the vice president becomes president, right? The president's killed or dies or cannot do his duty, right, for whatever reason. The vice president assumes that role, and the Senate elects its own pro tempore. Okay. The Senate is the one who tries the impeachment trials, right? So we saw that recently. And as we'll see, the House of Representatives has to bring the charges against the president to impeach them, but the Senate is where the trial happens. Aaliyah Bacon, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just this is when you were going over like the 3/5 compromise.
Yeah.
I was wondering if that's how you in the essay that's how you would write how each like the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists viewed slavery. Is that like that would be it? Like one thought that they counted people and the other thought they counted property.
Yes, but I would read through the documents that they write, like the Federalist paper and the paper written by Brutus, because it isn't as cut and dry for the Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, because you have Federalists who are slave owners,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have Anti-Federalists who are also slave owners.
All right.
So yeah, you just kind of have to look in there and see how they view it. And they kind of focus more on like the Constitution, on getting it passed, and what they want added. And the Anti-Federalists are really arguing that states' rights should be protected because that's what they're going to use to protect slavery.
Oh, okay.
So they want the states to have the right to either allow slavery or abolish slavery. They don't want the federal government to tell them what to do. That's the anti-federalist viewpoint on that. So they use it. Yeah. So they use this states' rights issue, right? And we're going to see this all the way up to the Civil War. That's what the Confederate States are arguing about, that it should be the states' rights. And they try to say, right, all the propaganda is that the Confederates try to say that they're protecting states' rights, not slavery. The war is over states' rights, not slavery, even though we all know that's not true, right? That's propaganda. It was over slavery. Um, so yeah, I would kind of focus in on those documents because they are written by the people that are in these different parties, and so they can, they'll give you some hints to that as well.
All right, thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Yep. When the Senate is holding an impeachment trial, uh, they have to be sworn in, either by oath of affirmation. When the United States president is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside. And you have to win 2/3 of the Senate. In other words, 2/3 of the Senate has to say he's guilty, let's get rid of him, right? And that's 60. He has to have 67 that vote to get rid of the president. On that note, we have impeached 3 presidents and almost impeached a 4th one. Richard Nixon resigned before we were actually able to level impeachment articles against him. But of those 3 impeachments, we have yet to remove anybody. Right? So all 3 presidents kept their job. All right. There you go. Judgment in cases of impeachment only can remove him from office. They cannot try him criminally. Okay. So it's only a loss of office. And then Section 4 talks about they have to have it at a regular time, at a regular place, not inconvenient to everybody. They have to meet at least once a year and on the first Monday in December, unless they appointed a different day. Section 5, the House shall be the judge of the elections. Okay. Anybody watch let me start with this. Did anybody attempt to watch the presidential debate last night?
I did.
Did you make it all the way through?
I couldn't because he was bickering too much, and then his son on drugs. Like it was just like, oh, you're a liar, you're a liar. I couldn't deal with it, so I had to stop.
Yeah. Yeah. What's
I,
that?
I don't even think Trump was trying to debate with, I don't even think he was trying to talk to the U.S. It seemed like he was strictly talking to Biden.
Yeah. My husband lasted 5 minutes. I lasted about 25 minutes, but for the same
It,
reason,
it's
right?
just like he's just saying direct things to him as opposed to what he can do more if reelected. That's just
Right.
funny to me.
Right. It was more of an argument between the 2 men. Now the part that I saw was the very beginning, and Biden had attempted to kind of put out his platform, but it didn't seem. And I think Trump was trying to as well, but it's just that's just him. He doesn't debate well, and I don't even think he knows what a debate is. But so anyway, they ended up arguing, but the reason I bring this up is because there's been a lot of back and forth over will the president accept the outcome of the election? And what happens with all of this mail-in voting? And, like they said last night, there's tens of thousands of people who have already voted. It's going to take longer to actually get the results in. And then, there's a lot of people who are saying that Trump's going to fight really hard and may not go peacefully, put it that way. So what happens when elections are in dispute like that? Based on Section 5, it goes back to the House of Representatives, right? Now, first, it talks about here in Section 5 that they have the governance over their own elections and has to keep a journal of its proceedings. But, and this is their money, this is how they get paid. You can't have any other office. All bills raising revenue, taxes have to come from the House. Every order is okay. So that just talks about the powers there. But the House of Representatives has the final say on. Actually, they posted an election. So if at the end of the presidential election, all the electoral college has been tallied and neither one has a majority, the House of Representatives then votes on its own, and the outcome of that is how they will decide the president. So again, it's another part that has put a lot of power in Congress and tried to limit the power of the other two. Okay, and they've actually tried to limit the power of the executive the most. They didn't want one person to have a lot of power. So this kind of goes through and describes that. Section 8 talks about they're the ones who can create taxes, can borrow money, regulate commerce, right? There's a list of things here. Post offices, this is on Congress, right? And there's been more come out in the last several months about trying to privatize the U.S. Postal Service. And that's something that Trump has said a lot about because he says it's not holding its own. It's not making it self-solvent. In other words, it doesn't make enough money every year to cover its expenses, which that may or may not be true. But it's up to Congress to figure that out, right? And you can see here, to establish post offices and post roads. They're the only ones who can increase budget for them. They're the only ones that can do away with them or, quote unquote, save them or pull them out of their debt. But they have to actually do it. And one of the problems that is erupting, at least more recently, is that you see a lot of bills that are going to the Senate created by the House who are dying. They're just killing those bills off. They're not moving on them. They're not voting on them. They're not doing anything. And a lot of that has to do with the infighting between the two parties because the Senate is right now is controlled by Republicans and the House is controlled by the Democrats. And being an election year, right, it's all very political. But it's up to Congress. Even if Trump wanted to do anything about the Postal Service through an executive order or anything like that, it's against the Constitution. Only the Congress can do stuff like that. All right. Tribunals, piracy, felonies. They can raise and support armies, but only for 2 years. Right? Again, we're going to how it's originally written. So as it is, right, original document here, the people can only vote on their representatives in the House of Representatives. That's their only vote. They cannot vote for president. They cannot vote for their senators. And they certainly don't vote for the Supreme Court justices. But we don't do that now. Right? So as the Constitution was originally written, we can only vote on our representatives that represent us in the House. Okay? Section 9. Now, this is also talking about slavery. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress until the year 1808. But we can tax it, right? But it won't exceed $10 per person. So, talking about slavery, it's basically saying that Congress cannot do anything about slavery until 1808. It can't do anything about the international slave trade or the national slave trade until 1808. So this is, again, a compromise that they had to make to get the South on board with the Constitution. And why do we need the South? Because at this point, our republic is very fragile. And the British are looking at us with greedy eyes, right? Because they warned us they were going to come back. They're still in Canada. All those troops are still there. So they had to make some compromises to keep this together. Now, was that a good decision? That's up for, debate. But this is what they did. And that was the reason they did it. Whether or not it was a good enough reason, again. All right, we talk about census there. You cannot charge taxes on goods. You cannot charge import taxes on stuff you buy from different states. You can charge import taxes on stuff you buy from a different country, right? And then section 10, no state can enter into an alliance. It has to be Congress, right? So you can't have Virginia in an alliance with France and then Connecticut in an alliance with England or Spain, right? So we get down to also, I'm sorry, in Article 9, it talks about Congress has the option to declare war. They're the only ones that can declare war. So how does that work when the president is the commander in chief of the armed services, right? What happens is he goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war. And Congress either approves it or doesn't, right? Now, a president can technically go to war, just not call it that. But he also has to get money from Congress. So the idea here is to limit the executive to having to depend on Congress for those two things. However, the first example, right, that comes to mind is the Vietnam conflict, or we call it the Vietnam War, because that's what it was. However, technically, it's only a conflict because Congress refused to declare war. In addition, Congress refused to support Lyndon B. Johnson's involvement. So there was no money given. So how did he pay for it? He borrowed, quote, borrowed from Social Security. And he's not the only one. Pretty much every president since then has, in some form or fashion, used Social Security as their own private savings account to do what they want, which is why we're in a bind today, right? Over Social Security. But that is how that works. That was an expansion of executive power. It was not constitutional by any means, but this is why they wrote in these limits, right, on the executive power. So Article 2 is about the executive. So Article 1 is really long, right? It has 10 sections. Article 2 is not that long. Again, they want this branch to be one of the weaker branches, actually the weakest one, right? And so the executive, i.e. the president, has to be 35, I believe. He has a term of 4 years, and he will be chosen with the vice president during the same term. And the way the election is written in here is the Electoral College, right? So this all discusses the Electoral College. Each state legislature, the way it's originally written, is to select electors, okay? And they get the same number of electors as they get representatives. Then they send these electors to the Capitol, and those electors vote for president. They're allowed to cast 2 ballots and for president, right? There is no election of a vice president here. It only outlines that whoever gets the most votes for president gets to be president, and whoever gets the second most votes gets to be vice president. Okay? They don't run on, there's no campaigns, they don't run together, they're not teamed up. And so this becomes a problem a little bit later because you have a president who is one party and a vice president who is the other, right? Specifically when we have John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. But this is how it's written. And in the case that neither party wins, or neither candidate wins the majority of the Electoral College, then it goes to the House of Representatives. Okay, so when you're looking at the presidential election, and again, it's going to be a little different this year because of all the mail-in voting, but they're looking at those numbers like 270, right? 270 is the magic number that they want to get in electoral votes, okay? Now, how does it work today as opposed to back then? The population, the general population of the states votes. And whoever wins that state, right? Let's say Biden wins Massachusetts, right? Then he gets all the Electoral College votes for Massachusetts. They all go to Biden. Let's say Trump, right? Let's say Trump wins Texas. It doesn't matter if he wins it 10 votes or 10,000 votes. If he gets more than Biden, he gets all the Electoral College votes for that state. Okay, so we do vote for president. Our vote does count because the way the Electoral College works today is based on how the people in that state vote. But back when how it was originally written, these were actual people that went and voted however they wanted. Okay. So this is how that is outlined there. Congress shall determine time and choosing of electors and the day. No person except a natural born citizen or citizen at the time of the Constitution can become president. And it says they have to be 35 years old and 14 years a resident within the United States. So even if you're born here and you live in the Caribbean, you can't become president, even though you're a natural born citizen. You have to live here for 14 years at least and be a natural born citizen. And where we see this come up, of course, from the birther movement started by Donald Trump, imagine that, about our President Barack Obama. And the allegation there was that he was born in Kenya, because his father is Kenyan. He was not. He was actually born in Hawaii, and his mother is from Hawaii, or was. I think she passed away. So he was born in the United States and definitely fulfilled the requirements for that. But you do see this consistent bickering over that, right? And we saw how terrible that got. So this is where that comes from, right? Because you do have to be a natural born citizen of the United States to be president. And some people think that this was to target or to keep Alexander Hamilton from becoming president, but we'll never know now, right? They didn't put that in writing. And the other thing to remember too is Ted Cruz was born in Canada, right? So we'll wait and see if he resurfaces as a presidential candidate and how they handle that. Okay, in case of removal of the president from office, either he's impeached, he dies, he resigns, or he is, he has a stroke and he cannot fulfill his duties, the vice president becomes president. And Congress may, by law, provide the case of removal. In other words, they will, if it's an instance of like medical incapacitation, then they'll decide. All right, Congress has to do that. The president will be paid, but it cannot be increased or diminished during his term. So whatever his pay is at the beginning of his term, it's going to be that way through the entire 4 years. There are no term limits in here for either Congress or the president. All it says is the president has a term of 4 years. It doesn't say how many terms he can have. So as it's originally written, he can serve as many terms as he gets elected. Right? Now, that's amended later in the 1950s, following the death of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He is elected 4 times. He's president for almost 16 years, but he dies in his 4th term. But then they pass an amendment that says, no, only 2 terms. But that's later. So as it's originally written, a president could serve for a lifetime as long as he continued to be elected. And this talks about his oath, right? What he has to say upon his inauguration. He'll be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the U.S. and of militias, right? He will have the power to grant reprieves or pardons against offenses in the United States, except in cases of impeachment. He has the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided the Senate concurs. He appoints ambassadors, other public ministers, federal judges, and justices of the Supreme Court, right, which came up a little bit last night. Congress has to vest them, and especially for the Supreme Court. So what happens? Supreme Court justices serve for a lifetime. They almost always serve until their death. They very rarely retire. So Kennedy's retirement is very suspect. But it's, you don't get a lot of turnover in the Supreme Court because they have a lifetime appointment. So if Trump gets his nominee in, he will be the first in a very long time to have 3 appointees. Okay. Some presidents serve 8 years and never get to appoint a Supreme Court justice. So it's a big deal. And whatever justice job comes available, in other words, whomever retires or passes away, their seat is filled. And it isn't seniority. The Chief Justice can only be appointed when the previous Chief Justice dies. And it isn't like they take from the other 8. They appoint a brand new person to the Chief Justice job. Okay. Now, after he makes an appointment and after he submits a nominee, then it's up to the Senate to confirm that person. Okay, so that's the Senate proceedings. Now, what happened with Gorsuch's, which was Trump's first Supreme Court justice nominee, was that there was a vacancy in the middle of Obama's 8th year as president, and he put forth several nominees, but Merrick Garland was the most prominent, and he should have been confirmed by the Senate, or at least he should have been vested by the Senate. But the Senate, being controlled by Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party, refused to hold hearings on it. So can they do that? Yes. Is it constitutional? No. Right? And their argument that they used was that it's an election year. You shouldn't be able to appoint a justice during an election year. Well, as we can see, that's not what the argument was about at all. Right? Very hypocritical. So, Trump's first appointment was Gorsuch, then Kavanaugh, and now Amy Barrett. Yeah, Amy Coney Barrett is his third. So we'll see if they're able to get her through the Senate. Again, this is why voting for your senators is almost more important than voting for president, because whoever controls the Senate can confirm or deny Supreme Court justices. They can remove presidents from office, all of those things. So at some point, right, the country is being held captive by a representative from Kentucky, i.e. Mitch McConnell. So that's why it's really, really important. And we'll go through the checks and balances after this. He has to give a State of the Union address. The president has to give a State of the Union speech. And you can impeach them on conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Like I said, we have impeached 3 presidents. Andrew Johnson is the first one. He'll be covered at the end because he's during Reconstruction. He was charged with violating a law, breaking the law over the Tenure of Office Act, and he narrowly kept his job. Then you have Bill Clinton, right? And he was charged with felony perjury, and he kept his job. And then Donald Trump was also charged with high crimes and misdemeanors and probably bribery for withholding aid from a country until that country agreed to influence the election and rig it so that Trump would win. And there was a lot of evidence to that, right? So that's the only ways we can try our president is through those crimes. Article 3 is the Supreme Court. And it talks about how they can serve for a lifetime, how they're appointed, good behavior. We had one that went a little crazy in the 18th century, 19th century, tried to get him out, right? So that's complicated, but you can do that. They will get paid. And the Supreme Court doesn't try criminal cases unless there's special circumstances. The Supreme Court only tries cases arising under the Constitution. Cases in which either the law or the spirit of the law is unconstitutional. And that is what the Supreme Court mainly does. They will try cases in which it's maritime law, piracy, ambassadors, or controversies where the United States as a country is a party. So they do try those. The trial of all crimes except in cases of impeachment shall be by jury. And that's talking about the establishment of federal courts. Okay. Impeachment, again, just Chief Justice serves over the trial that happens in the Senate. And the House of Representatives is basically the prosecution in that setting. It outlines what treason is, and this is where you get giving them aid and comfort, our enemies, and anyone who's going to try and influence the election one way or the other is an enemy. And the power to declare the punishment of treason. But you cannot issue attainders. So again, we kind of briefly talked about that before, but this is a British thing. If you're labeled a traitor, you're going to be executed, but your entire family is disinherited. They take away all their titles, take away all of their belongings. It's called a writ of attainder, right? So they're saying you can't do that. Even if you're removed from office as a traitor, your family cannot be harmed. Okay, and then these last 4 articles are not big at all. They deal with mostly like paperwork kind of thing. This talks about all the debts shall be honored even if they happen before the Constitution. Citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Now, here we go again with slavery. No person held in service or labor in one state escaping into another state, i.e. escaped slaves, this is called the Fugitive Slave Clause, shall, in consequence of regulation, be discharged from such service or labor, but must be given back to the party who claims their service or labor is due. So, if you have runaway slaves, they go from Virginia to New York. They are not free, right, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the Constitution, and they belong to whomever owned them in Virginia and should be sent back there. Fun times, all right? So, like I said, slavery's all over here. It talks about how we get new states in there, Section 4. It's up to Congress to make sure that every state sets up a Republican-type government. Article 5, how to fix it. So Article 5 is about how to amend the Constitution, and this is something that they knew they needed in the Articles of Confederation. So they realized in 1787 that they weren't going to be able to predict every single thing that was going to happen, and that this document was going to have to be changed as the decades progressed and new problems arose, right? So that's what Article 5 is, how to make amendments to the Constitution. Article 6 talks about debts. I'm sorry, give me 1 second. Oh. Okay. Senators and representatives and members of several state legislatures, both of the United States, have to take an oath of office, but no religious test shall be required. So this again is talking about the British. Because after the restoration of the monarchy, they made a law that said you had to be a Protestant to serve in the government. We don't want that here, right? You can be whatever religion you want. You can serve in office, doesn't matter. And Article 7, like I like to call the cheating clause, it's the last one, and it says that as long as 9 states agree to confirm the Constitution, that's enough to get it ratified. Yes, Asada Dawkins?
Yes, has anybody ever like committed treason like that's been publicized in the US? I know that it was a case with the whistleblower guy, but like I've never like I don't know if that was like a treason type crime or if it was just like I just know he was exiled, but I've never like heard of any cases of treason like in the US. So is there any ones that have been like probably affiliated with people in office?
Yes, there have. Hold on, give me 1 quick second. Okay, let me go through the traitors after. Let me just do this last article, and then we'll talk about the treason. The last one, like I said, cheating clause. Under the Articles of Confederation, technically all 13 states should have had to agree to this Constitution to get it passed. They weren't going to get 13 yeses. They knew that. So they added an amendment, like I said, the cheating clause, that just said they had to have a majority. In other words, they just had to have 9. So the ratification of the conventions in 9 states shall be sufficient, right? And it says unanimous consent of the states, and there you have George Washington, president and deputy from Virginia, all of the names there. And they finally got the Anti-Federalists to agree and sign off, by promising them a Bill of Rights. Okay, and so they worked with James Madison was part of that collaboration to get a Bill of Rights, and they passed them the first 10 amendments to the Constitution all in one big chunk. And that was how they got some of the Anti-Federalists to agree. Now there were still 4 states that said no, that didn't agree. Okay, for their own reasons. So this is why they had to add that 7th one on there, that 7th article. Like I said, it was kind of cheating, but either way. And so when you're thinking about your midterm assignment, we're talking about these 2 factions that erupt over the Constitution. They're arguing over the Constitution. And Federalists are going to put out a lot of propaganda about trying to get the Constitution passed and in support of the Constitution. They're going to try and sell it. They're going to tell you all the good things about it. And then they're going to try and tear down the Anti-Federalists' arguments against it. And vice versa. Anti-Federalists are going to try and critique the Constitution and say why we need these limits on power, why we need protections and not such a strong government. So that's where the argument erupts, because after this is approved by the Congress, it's then sent to each state, and each state's assembly, their representation and their Congress in each state has to say yes or no. So after it's released to the public, to these states, that's when you start to see this public debate between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And they do this through publishing essays. They publish the Federalist papers, they publish the Anti-Federalist papers in the newspapers. Again, we're highly literate. Americans are very literate. So they read this, and they're hoping to influence their side one way or the other. Right? That's what the Federalists and Anti-Federalists are about. And the Anti-Federalists do come to the table because they promised the Bill of Rights, right? Okay, so stop sharing there and go back to treason. All right, so there was one incident of treason that was definitely treasonous very early on, and that was Thomas Jefferson's vice president, Aaron Burr, right? The man who shot Alexander Hamilton.
Oh, okay.
But he wasn't a traitor because he shot Alexander Hamilton, because that technically was legal. That was a duel, and duels were legal in New Jersey, which is where it happened. But while he was vice president, he was elected vice president under Thomas Jefferson's second term. He attempted to encourage Mexico to invade the United States. So he colluded and collaborated with an enemy, right? And he was trying to set up the Louisiana Purchase, or half the Louisiana Purchase, as his own empire, his own kingdom. And there was a lot of proof of this, but they didn't have the 2 eyewitnesses, which is what's required on the Constitution to do it. And so he ran away. He was basically exiled, but he just left the country because he knew they were coming for him. But they couldn't impeach him on treason in Congress because they didn't have the 2 eyewitnesses.
Oh, okay. I have another question too about that, but I'm gonna let you. I'll wait till you're finished.
Okay. The other issue about treason, there's 2 others, right? You're talking about the whistleblower, Edward Norton, probably, and no, I'm sorry, not Edward Norton.
Yes.
Snowden.
Oh, the
Snowden.
other guy. No, yeah, no.
Edward Snowden. So what did he do? And then there's Chelsea Manning, right? Under the U.S. Patriot Act, they suspended a lot of, like the writ of habeas corpus. If the president, labeled you a terrorist or suspected you of terrorism, a terrorist suspect, they could put you in jail and hold you indefinitely without charging you. And that's against the Constitution. But the Patriot Act suspended that rule, the writ of habeas corpus, as long, with those certain caveats that the president had identified you as this. And what they did then is they would take them to Guantanamo Bay and interrogate them aggressively, if you get my meaning, until they either confessed or they let them in on other terrorist plots or told them everything they knew and they weren't a terrorist, right? So under the U.S. Patriot Act, it gave the NSA and the CIA and the FBI a lot more power over, say, phone tapping and surveillance of private U.S. citizens. And so legally they could do that, but under the Patriot Act, there had to be a reason they were doing it, like they suspect you of terrorism or whatnot. And what Snowden exposed was that they were doing it to everybody, right? Big Brother was really watching everybody. And so he exposes that, but he does it in a way in which there's a lot of national security information that he let out there. At least that's what they claimed. Okay, and so when he exposed and opened that up, I want to say he went through WikiLeaks, right? Is that, if my memory serves? The government, of course, was very upset, but he wasn't wrong. And ideally, he's supposed to be protected because he's a whistleblower, but he did leak some pretty risky information. And the stuff that he did, not just the stuff about surveilling everybody, but other methods that the government used that they protect because they don't want other governments to do the same thing to us, right? So there was some violations of national security there, which is why they have charged him, right? But he's not in the country. So, and he's in a country that will not extradite him back here. So he hasn't been arraigned in court because he's not in the U.S., right? The other issue too, Chelsea Manning. I can't remember. She's transgender. I can't remember what her name was when she was in the Army. She exposed what was happening at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, where there was torture going on. Torture is against the Geneva Accord. It's also against the Constitution, right? And so she let a bunch of that information out, that this was happening and how badly they were treating people there, and that the military was covering this up. And so she was brought up on charges through the military court. She was court-martialed because she was an Army. I can't remember what her rank was, but she was, in it in Iraq enough to where she had access to all this information. So they charged her again with, exposing secrets to the enemy, but at the same time, she was really just exposing it to the world. And she's been pardoned, I believe, but she was in jail for a while, and they did not treat her well. So those have been like the cases that are, quote, treasonous, but some of them aren't, as egregious as, say, Aaron Burr's were. And the other, again, the instance I mentioned earlier is Trump asking or saying to the Ukraine that they will not deliver aid unless the Ukraine opens up investigations against his opponent, such as Hunter Biden, that has business in the Ukraine. And then, of course, his collusion with Russia, right? So those would be treasonous crimes. But as we can see, the Senate's not going to vote to remove him, even if, as he says, he could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue, right? That's a sad state when he can say that and it's true. Do you guys have any other questions? I know we went long on the Constitution, but I hope that this helps you with your midterm paper and kind of going forward with that. Asada?
Yes, I do have a question. So I remember you said about the Anti-Federalists, how they really were fighting for states' rights to protect slavery, right? But
Yep.
didn't the Federalists like wanting like for trying to ratify the Constitution, like wasn't there like an article in the Constitution that was supposed to also protect slavery as well, or like sending them basically abolishing it? But like I feel like there were like some racist articles in there as well. So were they both like were both groups kind of like not like acknowledging slavery, but obviously like not really trying to do much about it? Like I kind of thought it was split at first. Like the Federalists were for slavery.
Okay, so the thing is, the Federalists support the Constitution as it's written. And as we said, there's slavery all over the Constitution, right? Because you brought up the Three-Fifths Compromise. Section 9 of Article 1 says that they can't do anything about it till 1808. Then you have, there's several other pieces in there about slavery. And the anti-federalists, so basically it's not so clear and dry. It's not so cut and dry, I'm sorry. You have Federalists such as James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, who's a slave owner. He owns slaves. Then you have Thomas Jefferson, who's an anti-federalist, who also owns slaves. Right? So you would think, right, the line would be drawn, north versus south as far as Federalist versus anti-federalist, but it isn't. Okay, and when Madison is writing this, he's basically saying this is an issue for another time. In 1808, we can discuss this again, right? He's basically punting the problem to later on down the road. And he's
Right, because
also,
in the book it says that they were trying to continue it for 20 more years. Something like
yes,
that they were trying to continue slavery for like another 20 years.
yeah, they were. And as it says in the Constitution, till 1808. So they ratify it and get your first president in 1788. So yeah, that's 20 years. And so, in other words, it's complicated is the short answer. But Madison and others saw that, or hoped that they could gradually emancipate slaves and do away with slavery. But again, he's a slave owner. So, and what he did
That's
was,
why I'm so confused, because that's really confusing. I'm like, what side are you on? Because I don't know, like, if both of them, like, if both parties maybe, like, just wanted to ride it out because they couldn't, or they felt like they couldn't do anything in the moment, or, like, that was kind of...
yeah, they basically agree not to do anything in the moment because it would tear apart the republic. And I think a lot of them realized that this was going to be a huge divisive issue. And as we see, right, it takes an entire civil war, 5 years of warfare to get slavery. So, like you said, at the moment, I think they decided that we're going to deal with this later. And so, right, you have the protection of slavery as it exists right then. And those are the protection clauses that are in there. Because I think they
So
realized
both parties were protecting it.
well, the Constitution protects it as it is. So that's the Federalist viewpoint. They protect it as it is, but they
Right.
also kind of put in there that they're going to revisit this in 20 years. Whereas your
Right, as far as
anti-federalists,
the anti-federalists, they didn't. Oh, okay.
the anti-federalists, yeah, they were protecting states' rights because even if in 20 years the states decided to abolish slavery, they wanted it to be a state decision. They didn't want it to be a national decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yep. Okay, anybody else? Just make sure that you put your name in the chat before you leave. It's 12:30. And I'll stop recording. Aaron Spencer.
Yeah.